Gilles Deleuze. Felix Guattari. Rhizome. Introduction. We wrote Anti-Oedipus together. As each of us was several, it was already a lot of people. Here we used everything that approached us, the nearest and the most distant. We distributed clever pseudonyms, to make it unrecognizable. Why did we keep our names? Out of habit, just out of habit. To make us unrecognizable in turn. To make imperceptible, not ourselves, but what makes us act, feel, or think. And then because it's nice to talk like everyone else, and to say the sun is rising, when everyone knows that's a way of speaking. Not to arrive at the point where one no longer says I, but at the point where it no longer has any importance to say or not to say I. We are no longer ourselves. Everyone will know their own. We have been helped, sucked, multiplied. We no longer talk much about psychoanalysis, yet we still talk about it, and too much. Nothing goes through that anymore. We were deeply tired of it, but unable to stop right away. Psychoanalysts and especially the psychoanalyzed bore us too much. This matter which was delaying us, we had to rush it on our behalf, without having any illusions about the objective scope of such an operation. We had to communicate to it an artificial speed capable of carrying it to the point of rupture or cracking for us. It's over, we won't talk about psychoanalysis at all after this book. No one will suffer, neither them nor us. It's curious, how the objections that are made to you are retards. When you try to swim in a stream, they put balls on your feet. Have you thought about this? What about that? Are you consistent? Don't you see the contradiction? Sweetness too, never to answer. There is only one thing worse than objections and refutations of objections, and that is reflection, going back to. For example, in a book, going back to a previous book. What about? Did you understand Freud correctly? And your last book, have you changed? Take stock, what a horror. A book has no object or subject, it is made of variously formed materials, of very different dates and speeds. As soon as we attribute the book to a subject, we neglect this work of materials, and the exteriority of their relationships. We make a god for geological movements. In a book as in everything, there are lines of articulation or segmentarity, strata, territorialities. But also lines of flight, movements of deterritorialization and destratification. The compared velocities of flux flow according to these lines lead to phenomena of relative delay, viscosity, or on the contrary precipitation and rupture. Yes, psychoanalysis was our ball and chain, we had to file. All this, the measurable lines and speeds, constitutes a mechanical arrangement. A book is such an assemblage, as such unattributable. It is a multiplicity, but we do not yet know what the multiple implies when it ceases to be attributed, that is, when it is raised to the status of a substantive. A machinic assemblage is turned towards the strata which undoubtedly make it a kind of organism, either a signifying totality, or else a determination attributable to a subject, but no less towards a body without organs, which never ceases to undo the organism, to cause meaningless particles to pass and circulate, pure intensities, and to attribute to itself the subjects to which it leaves only a name as a trace of an intensity. What is the body without organs of a book? There are several of them, according to the nature of the lines considered, according to their content or their own density, according to their possibility of convergence on a plane of consistency which ensures their selection. Here as elsewhere, the main thing is the units of measurement. Quantify writing. There is no difference between what a book is about and how it is made. A book therefore has no more object. As an assemblage, it is only itself in connection with other assemblages, in relation to other bodies without organs. We will never ask what a book means, signified or signified, we will not try to understand anything in a book, we will ask ourselves what it functions with, in connection with what it does or does not cause intensities to pass, into what multiplicities it introduces and metamorphoses his own, with which bodies without organs he himself makes his own converge. A book exists only from the outside and outside. Thus, a book being itself a small machine, in what measurable relationship does this literary machine have a war machine, a love machine, a revolutionary machine, etc.? And with a abstract machine? Who drives them? We have been criticized for too often invoking literary men. Stupid objection. Because the only question when one writes is to know with which other machine the literary machine can be connected, and must be connected to function. Kleist and a crazy war machine, Kafka and an incredible bureaucratic machine. And if we became animal or vegetable? By literature, which certainly does not mean literally. Wouldn't it be first by the voice that one becomes animal? Literature is an assemblage, it has nothing to do with ideology, there is not and there never has been ideology. We don't talk about anything else. Multiplicities, lines, strata and segmentarities, lines of flight and intensities, machinic arrangements and their different types, bodies without organs and their construction, their selection, the plane of consistency, the units of measurement in each case. The stratometers. The dileometers. The CSO units of density. The convergence CSO units. Not only form a quantification of writing, but define it as always being the measure of something else. Writing has nothing to do with signifying, but with surveying, mapping, even lands to come. A first type of book is the root book. The tree is already the image of the world, or else the root is the image of the world tree. It is the classic book, as a beautiful organic, significant and subjective interiority, the strata of the book. The book imitates the world, like art, nature, by processes of its own, and which bring to fruition what nature cannot or can no longer do. The law of the book is that of reflection, the one that becomes two. How would the law of the book be in nature, since it presides over the very division between world and book, nature and art? One becomes two. Each time we come across this formula, even if it were strategically stated by Mao, even if it were understood the most dialectically in the world, we find ourselves faced with the most classical and thoughtful thought, the oldest, the most tired. Nature doesn't work that way. The roots themselves are pivotal, with more numerous, lateral and circular branching, not dichotomous. The mind lags behind nature. Even the book as a natural reality is pivoting, with its axis, and the leaves around it. But the book as a spiritual reality, the tree or the root as an image, continues to develop the law of one which becomes two, then two which becomes four. Binary logic is the spiritual reality of the tree root. Even a discipline as advanced as linguistics retains this root tree as its basic image, which links it to classical reflection, thus Chomsky and the syntagmatic tree, starting at a point S to proceed by dichotomy. In other words, this thought has never understood the multiplicity. It needs a strong supposed main unit to arrive at two following a spiritual method. And on the side of the object, according to the natural method, we can undoubtedly pass directly from the 1 to 3, 4, or 5, but always on the condition of having a strong principal unit, that of the pivot which supports the roots. Secondary. It's not much better. One-to-one relationships between successive circles have only replaced the binary logic of dichotomy. The taproot does not understand multiplicity any more than the dichotomy root. One operates in the object while the other operates in the subject. Binary logic and one-to-one relationships still dominate psychoanalysis, the tree of delirium introvers Freudian interpretation, linguistics and structuralism, even computer science. The root system, or fasciculate root, is the second figure of the book, which our modernity willingly claims. This time, the main root has aborted, or is being destroyed towards its tip. Comes to be grafted on it an immediate and unspecified multiplicity of secondary roots which take a great development. This time, the natural reality appears in the abortion of the main root, but its unity nevertheless remains as past or to come, as possible. And we must ask ourselves if spiritual and reflective reality does not compensate for the state of affairs by manifesting in its turn the demand for an even more comprehensive secret unity, or for a more extensive totality. Either the method of cut up by Burroughs. The folding of one text over another, constituting multiple and even adventitious roots, it looks like a cutting, implies an additional dimension to that of the texts considered. It is in this additional dimension of folding that the unit continues its spiritual work. It is in this sense that the most resolutely fragmented work can just as well be presented as the total work or the grand opus. Most of the modern methods for making series proliferate or for making a multiplicity grow are perfectly valid in a direction, for example linear, while a unit of totalization asserts itself all the more in another dimension, that of a circle or of a cycle. Each time a multiplicity finds itself caught in a structure, its growth is compensated by a reduction in the laws of combination. The abortionists of the unit are indeed angel makers here. Doctors angelici. Since they affirm a properly angelic and superior unity. Joyce's words, aptly called multiple-rooted, effectively break the linear unity of the word, or even of the language, only by positing a cyclical unity of the sentence, of the text or of knowledge. Nietzsche's aphorisms break the linear unity of knowledge only by referring to the cyclical unity of the eternal return, present as an unknown in thought. In other words, the fasciculated system does not really break with dualism, with the complementarity of a subject and an object, of a natural reality and a spiritual reality. Unity continues to be thwarted and impeded in the object, while a new type of unity triumphs in the subject. The world has lost its pivot, the subject can no longer even make a dichotomy, but accesses a higher unity of ambivalence or overdetermination, in a dimension that is always additional to that of its object. The world has become chaos, but the book remains an image of the world, chaosmos root, instead of cosmos root. Strange mystification, that of the book all the more total than fragmented. The book as an image of the world, anyway what a bland idea. In truth, it is not enough to say vive le multiple, although this cry is difficult to utter. No typographical, lexical, or even syntactic skill will suffice to make it heard. The many. It has to be done. Not by always adding a superior dimension, but on the contrary in the simplest way, by dint of sobriety, at the level of the dimensions at our disposal, always n1, it is only thus that one is part of the multiple, in always being subtracted. Subtracting the unique from the multiplicity to be constituted. Right to n1. Such a system could be called a rhizome. A rhizome as an underground stem is absolutely distinct from roots and rootlets. Bulbs, tubers are rhizomes. Plants with roots or rootlets can be rhizomorphs in all other respects. It is a question of knowing if botany, in its specificity, is not entirely rhizomorphic. Even animals are, in their pack form, rats are rhizomes. The burrows are, in all their functions of habitat, provision, displacement, dodging and rupture. The rhizome itself has very diverse forms, from its superficial extension branched in all directions to its concretions in bulbs and tubers. When the rats slip under each other, there is the best and the worst in the rhizome. Potato and quackgrass, weed. Animal and plant, quackgrass is crabgrass. We feel that we will not convince anyone if we do not enumerate certain approximate characteristics of the rhizome. 1 degree and 2 degrees, principles of connection and heterogeneity. Any point of a rhizome can be connected with any other, and must be. It is very different from the tree or the root which fixes a point, an order. The linguistic tree in the manner of Chomsky again begins at a point S and proceeds by dichotomy. In a rhizome, on the contrary, each feature does not necessarily refer to a linguistic feature. Semiotic links of all kinds are connected there to very diverse modes of encoding, biological, political, economic links, etc., bringing into play not only regimes of different signs, but also statuses of states of affairs. Collective assemblages of enunciation. Indeed work directly in mechanical arrangements. And one cannot establish a radical break between the regimes of signs and their objects. In linguistics, even when one claims to stick to the explicit and assume nothing of language, one remains within the spheres of a discourse which still implies modes of arrangement and types of social power. Individuals. Chomsky's grammatically, the category symbol S that dominates all sentences, is first a marker of power before being a syntactic marker. You will constitute grammatically correct sentences, you will divide each statement into nominal symptom and verbal symptom, first dichotomy. We will not criticize such linguistic models for being too abstract, but on the contrary for not being abstract enough, for not achieving abstract machine, which operates the connection of a language with the semantic and pragmatic contents of statements, with collective arrangements of enunciation, with the whole micropolitics of the social field. A rhizome would never stop connecting semiotic links, organizations of power, occurrences referring to the arts, sciences, social struggles. A semiotic link is like a tuber clumping together very diverse acts, linguistic, but also perceptual, mimic, gestural, cogitative. There is no language in itself, nor universality of language, but a combination of dialects, patois, slangs, special languages. There is no ideal speaker-listener, any more than there is a homogeneous linguistic community. Language is, according to Weinreich, an essentially heterogeneous reality. 1. There is no mother tongue, but power taken by a dominant language in a political multiplicity. The language stabilizes around a parish, a bishopric, a capital. She is bulbous. It evolves by stems and underground flows, along river valleys, or railway lines, it moves by oil spots. 2. We can always operate on the language of internal structural decompositions. This is not fundamentally different from a search for roots. There is always something genealogical in the tree, it is not a popular method. On the contrary, a rhizome-type method can only analyze language by decentering it on other dimensions and other registers. A language never closes in on itself except in a function of powerlessness. 3-degree principle of multiplicity. It is only when the multiple is effectively treated as substantive, multiplicity, that it no longer has any relationship with the one as subject or as object, as natural or spiritual reality, as image and world. The multiplicities are rhizomatic, and denounce the arbor-sent pseudo-multiplicities. No unity which serves as a pivot in the object, nor which is divided in the subject. No unity if only to abort in the object, and to return in the subject. A multiplicity has neither subject nor object, but only determinations, magnitudes, dimensions which cannot grow without it changing in nature, the laws of combination therefore grow with multiplicity. The threads of the puppet, as rhizome or multiplicity, do not refer to the supposed will of an artist or a showman, but to the multiplicity of nerve fibers which in turn form another puppet following other dimensions connected to the first. The threads or rods that move the puppets, let's call them the weft. One could object that his multiplicity lies in the person of the actor who projects it into the text. Fine, but its nerve fibers in turn form a weft. And they plunge through the gray mass, the grid, even into the undifferentiated. The game approaches the pure activity of the weavers, that which the myths attribute to the fates and the norns. 3. An assemblage is precisely this growth of dimensions in a multiplicity which necessarily changes in nature as it increases its connections. There are no points or positions in a rhizome, as found in a structure, a tree, a root. There are only lines. When Glenn Gould accelerates the execution of a piece, he not only acts as a virtuoso, he transforms the musical points into lines, he makes the whole proliferate. This is because the number has ceased to be a universal concept which measures elements according to their place in any dimension, to become itself a variable multiplicity according to the dimensions considered, primacy of the domain over a complex of numbers attached to this area. We have no units of measurement, only multiplicities or varieties of measurement. The notion of unity only ever appears when there is a seizure of power by the signifier in a multiplicity, or a corresponding process of subjectivation. Thus the pivotal unit which founds a set of biunivocal relations between elements or objective points, or else the one which is divided according to the law of a binary logic of differentiation in the subject. The unit always operates within an empty dimension additional to that of the system considered, overcoding. But precisely, a rhizome or multiplicity cannot be overcoded, never has an additional dimension to the number of its lines, that is to say to the multiplicity of numbers attached to these lines. All multiplicities are flat insofar as they occupy all their dimensions. We will therefore speak of a plane of consistency. Multiplicities, although this plane has increasing dimensions according to the number of connections that are established on it. Multiplicities are defined from the outside by the abstract line of flight or deterritorialization according to which they change nature by connecting with others. The plane of consistency, grid, is the outside of all multiplicities. The line of flight marks both the reality of a number of finite dimensions that multiplicity effectively fills. The impossibility of any additional dimension, without the multiplicity being transformed along this line. The possibility and the necessity of flattening all these multiplicities on the same plane of consistency or exteriority, whatever their dimensions. The ideal of a book would be to spread out everything on such a plane of exteriority, on a single page, on the same range. Lived events, historical determinations, thought concepts, individuals, groups, and social formations. Kleist invented a writing of this type, a broken chain of affects, with variable speeds, precipitations, and transformations, always in relation to the outside. Open rings. Also his texts are opposed in all respects to the classic and romantic book, constituted by the interiority of a substance or a subject. The book war machine versus the book state apparatus. The n-dimensional flat multiplicities are a significant and adjectives. They are designated by indefinite articles, or rather partitives, it is. Of. Quackgrass. Of. Rhizome. Above all, we will not ask ourselves what a multiplicity means, nor to whom it is attributed. But given any given multiplicity, e.g. fascism. Horrible multiplicity, defined by its lines or dimensions, precisely spread out on the plane of consistency, one will wonder along which dimension it signifies this or that, along which line it is attributed to an individual, to a group or to a social training. Because there is an individual fascism, a group fascism, a social formation fascism. And precisely these distinctions are not relevant, but secondary and derivative in relation to the direct study of multiplicities. 4. Let's hammer, let's flatten to be blacksmiths of the unconscious. 4-degree principle of a significant break. Against the two significant cuts which separate the structures, or cross one of them. A rhizome can be broken in any place, it resumes along this or that of its lines and along other lines. There is no end to ants, because they form an animal rhizome most of which can be destroyed without ceasing to reconstitute itself. Every rhizome comprises lines of segmentarity according to which it is stratified, territorialized, organized, signified, attributed, etc. But also lines of deterritorialization through which he constantly flees. There is a break in the rhizome whenever segmental lines explode into a line of flight, but the line of flight is part of the rhizome. These lines keep coming back to each other. This is why one can never give oneself a dualism or a dichotomy, even in the rudimentary form of good and bad. We make a break, we trace a line of flight, but we always risk finding on it organizations that restrify the whole, formations that restore power to a signifier, attributions that reconstitute a subject, everything that we wants, from Oedipal resurgences to fascist concretions. They called us fascists. We will never be fascism enough, so much are we aware, we at least, that fascism is not that of others only. Groups and individuals contain microfascisms just waiting to crystallize. Yes, quackgrass is also a rhizome. The good and the bad can only be the product of an active and temporary selection, to be started over. How could the movements of deterritorialization and the processes of reterritorialization not be relative, perpetually connected, caught up in each other? The orchid is deterritorialized by forming an image, a wasp tracing. But the wasp reterritorializes itself on this image. It deterritorializes itself, however, becoming itself a part in the reproductive apparatus of the orchid. But it reterritorializes the orchid, by transporting its pollen. The wasp and the orchid form a rhizome, as heterogeneous. One could say that the orchid imitates the wasp whose image it reproduces in a significant way, mimesis, mimicry, lure, etc. But this is only true at the level of strata, parallelism between two strata such that a vegetable organization on one imitates an animal organization on the other. At the same time it's about something else. No longer imitation at all, but capture of code, added value of code, increase in valence, true becoming, becoming wasp of the orchid, becoming orchid of the wasp, each of these becomings ensuring the deterritorialization of one of the terms and the reterritorialization of the other, the two becomings linking together and taking turns following a circulation of intensities that pushes the deterritorialization ever further. There is no imitation or resemblance, but an explosion of two heterogeneous series in the line of flight composed of a common rhizome that can no longer be attributed, nor subjected to anything significant. Remy Chauvin says very well. Aparallel evolution. Of two beings who have absolutely nothing to do with each other. 5. More generally, evolutionary schemes may increasingly be driven away from the old tree and descent model. Under certain conditions, a virus can connect to germ cells and transmit itself as a cellular gene of a complex species. Much more, it could flee, pass into the cells of a completely different species, not without taking away genetic information from the first host, thus current research by Benveniste and Todaro on a type C virus, in its double connection with baboon DNA and DNA from some species of domestic cats. The patterns of evolution would no longer be made only according to models of arborescent descent, going from the least differentiated to the most differentiated, but following a rhizome operating immediately in the heterogeneous and jumping from one already differentiated line to another. 6. Here again. Parallel evolution. Of the baboon and the cat, where one is obviously not the model of the other, nor the other the copy of one, a becoming baboon in the cat would not mean that the cat does the baboon. We rhizome with our viruses, or rather our viruses make us rhizome with other animals. As Jacob says, the transfer of genetic material by virus or other processes, the fusions of cells from different species, have results analogous to those of the abominable loves dear to antiquity and the Middle Ages. 7. Transversal communications between differentiated lines blur the genealogical trees. Always look for the molecular, or even the submolecular particle with which we make an alliance. We evolve and we die of our polymorphous and rhizomatic flues, more than of our diseases of descent or which themselves have their descent. The rhizome is an anti-genealogy. It's the same for the book and the world. The book is not an image of the world, following an ingrained belief. It forms a rhizome with the world. There is an aparallel evolution of the book and the world. The book ensures the deterritorialization of the world, but the world operates a reterritorialization of the book, which in turn deterritorializes itself in the world, as he is able and if he can. Mimetic is a very bad concept, depending on a binary logic, for phenomena of a completely different nature. The crocodile does not reproduce a tree trunk, any more than the chameleon reproduces the colors of the surroundings. The pink panther imitates nothing, it reproduces nothing, it paints the world in its color, pink on pink, it is its becoming world, so as to become imperceptible itself, a significant itself, to make its break, her own line of flight, to carry her aparallel evolution through to the end. Wisdom of plants. Even when they have roots, there is always an outside where they form a rhizome with something, with the wind, with an animal, with man, and also an aspect by which the animals themselves form a rhizome, and men, etc. Drunkenness as a triumphant eruption of the plant within us. And always following the rhizome by breaking, lengthening, prolonging, relaying the line of flight, varying it, until producing the most abstract and tortuous line to not dimensions, with broken directions. Combined territorialized flows. Follow the plants. We will start by fixing the limits of a first line according to circles of convergence around successive singularities. Then we see if, inside this line, new circles of convergence are established with new points located outside the limits and in other directions. To write, to create a rhizome, to increase its territory by deterritorialization, to extend the line of flight to the point where it covers the entire plane of consistency in an abstract machine. First go to your first plant and there observe carefully how the run-off water flows from that point. The rain must have carried the seeds away. Follow the channels that the water has dug, so you will know the direction of the flow. Look for the plant which, in this direction, is furthest from yours. Anything that grows between those two is yours. Later, when the latter in turn sow their seeds, you can follow the course of the waters from each of these plants to increase your territory. 8. Music has not ceased to pass its lines of flight, like so many multiplicities to transformation, even by reversing its own codes which structure or arborify it. This is why the musical form, even in its ruptures and proliferations, is comparable to weeds, a rhizome. 9. 5 degrees and 6 degrees, principle of cartography and transfer. A rhizome is not subject to any structural or generative model. It is foreign to any idea of genetic axis, like deep structure. A genetic axis is like an objective pivotal unit on which successive stages are organized. A deep structure is rather like a basic suite that can be broken down into immediate constituents, while the unity of the product passes into another dimension, transformational and subjective. We do not thus leave the representative model of the tree, or of the root, pivotal or fasciculate, for example the combskin tree, associated with the basic sequence, and representing the process of its generation according to a logic binary. Variation on the oldest thought. Of the genetic axis or of the deep structure, we say that they are above all principles of layer. Infinitely reproducible. The whole logic of the tree is a logic of tracing and reproduction. Both in linguistics and in psychoanalysis, its object is an unconscious itself representative, crystallized in codified complexes, distributed on a genetic axis or distributed in a syntagmatic structure. Its purpose is the description of a state of affairs, the rebalancing of intersubjective relations, or the exploration of an unconscious already there, lurking in the dark recesses of memory and language. It consists in tracing something that we give ourselves ready-made, from a structure that overcodes or from an axis that supports. The tree articulates and hierarchizes the layers are like the leaves of the tree. Quite different is the rhizome. Map and not layer. Make the map, not the tracing. The orchid does not reproduce the layer of the wasp, it makes a card with the wasp within a rhizome. If the map opposes the tracing, it is because it is entirely turned towards an experiment in touch with reality. The map does not reproduce an unconscious closed in on itself, it constructs it. It contributes to the connection of fields, to the unblocking of bodies without organs, to their maximum opening on a plane of consistency. It is itself part of the rhizome. The card is open, it can be connected in all its dimensions, dismantled, reversed, liable to constantly receive modifications. It can be torn, reversed, adapted to assemblies of any kind, be started by an individual, a group, a social formation. You can draw it on a wall, design it as a work of art, construct it as a political action or as a meditation. It is perhaps one of the most important characteristics of the rhizome, to always have multiple entries. The burrow in this sense is an animal rhizome, and sometimes includes a clear distinction between the line of flight as a corridor of movement, and the strata of reserve or habitation, cf. the muskrat. A map has multiple entries, unlike the layer which always comes back to the same. A map is a matter of performance, while the layer always refers to a supposed competence. Contrary to psychoanalysis, to psychoanalytical competence, which reduces each desire and statement to a genetic axis or an overcoding structure, and which endlessly pulls the monotonous tracings of the stages on this axis or of the constituents in this structure, schizoanalysis refuses any idea of traced fatality, whatever name one gives it: divine, anagogic, historical, economic, structural, hereditary or syntagmatic. We can clearly see how Melanie Klein does not understand the problem of mapping one of her patient children, little Richard, and is content to draw ready-made tracings, Oedipus, the good and the bad dad, the bad and the good mother, while the child desperately tries to pursue a performance that psychoanalysis absolutely ignores. 10. Partial drives and objects are neither stages on the genetic axis, nor positions in a deep structure. They are political options for problems, entrances and exits, impasses that the child experiences politically, that is to say, in all the force of his desire. However, aren't we restoring a simple dualism by opposing maps to layers, like a good side and a bad side? Isn't it the nature of a map to be able to be traced? Isn't it the nature of a rhizome to cross roots, to sometimes merge with them? Doesn't a map include redundancy phenomena which are already like its own layers? Doesn't a multiplicity have its strata where unifications and totalizations, massifications, mimetic mechanisms, significant seizures of power, subjective attributions take root? Even the lines of flight will not reproduce, thanks to their eventual divergence, the formations that they had the function of undoing or turning around. But the reverse is also true. It is a question of method. Always transfer the overlay to the map. And this operation is not at all symmetrical to the previous one. Because strictly speaking it is not exact that a layer reproduces the map. It is rather like a photo, an X-ray which would begin by choosing or isolating what it intends to reproduce, using artificial means, using dyes or other processes of constraint. It is always the imitator who creates his model, and attracts it. The layer has already translated the map into an image, it has already transformed the rhizome into roots and rootlets. He organized, stabilized, neutralized the multiplicities according to axes of significance and subjectivation which are his. It has generated, structured the rhizome, and the tracing already reproduces only itself when it believes it is reproducing something else. This is why it is so dangerous. It injects redundancies, and propagates them. What the tracing reproduces from the map or the rhizome are only the impasses, the blockages, the seeds of pivot or the points of structuring. See psychoanalysis and linguistics. One has only ever drawn tracings or photos of the unconscious, the other, tracings or photos of language, with all the betrayals that implies. No wonder that psychoanalysis has hung its lot on that of linguistics. See what was already happening for little Hans, in pure child psychoanalysis. We did not stop him. Break its rhizome. From him. Stain your card. To turn it right side up, to block every way out, until he desires his own shame and guilt, until shame and guilt are rooted in him. Phobia. The rhizome of the building is barred from it, then that of the street, it is rooted in the bed of the parents, it is rooted on its own body, it is blocked on Professor Freud. Freud explicitly takes into account the cartography of little Hans, but always and only to reduce it to a family photo. And see what Melanie Klein is doing with little Richard's geopolitical maps. She takes photos of it, she makes layers of it, strike a pose or follow the axis, genetic stage or structural destiny. We will break your rhizome. We'll let you live and talk, on condition that you close off any way out. When a rhizome is clogged, arborified, it's over, nothing more happens from desire. For it is always by rhizome that desire moves and produces. Every time desire follows a tree, there are internal fallouts that cause it to fall and lead to death. But the rhizome operates on desire by external and productive impulses. This is why it is so important to try the other operation, inverse but not symmetrical. Reconnect the layers on the map, relate the roots or the trees to a rhizome. To study the unconscious, in the case of little Hans, would be to show how he tries to form a rhizome, with the family home, but also with the line of flight of the building, the street, etc. How these lines are crossed out, the child being rooted in the family, photographed under the father, traced on the maternal bed. Then how the intervention of Professor Freud ensures a seizure of power of the signifier as a subjectivation of affects. How the child can no longer flee except in the form of a becoming animal apprehended as shameful and guilty, the becoming horse of little Hans, a real political option. But always it would be necessary to resituate the impasses on the map, and thereby open them up to possible lines of flight. It would be the same for a group card. Show at what point of the rhizome are formed phenomena of massification, bureaucracy, leadership, fascism, etc., which lines nevertheless remain, even underground, continuing to obscurely form a rhizome. The Deligny method. Map the gestures and movements of an autistic child, combine several cards for the same child, for several children. 11. If it is true that the map or the rhizome essentially have multiple entrances, we will even consider that we can enter it by the way of the layers or the way of the tree roots, taking into account the necessary precautions. Here again we will give up a Manichean dualism. For example, we will often be forced to turn in dead ends, to go through signifying powers and subjective affectations, to rely on Oedipal, paranoid or even worse formations, such as unhardened territorialities which make other transformational operations possible. It may even be that psychoanalysis serves, in spite of itself, as a point of support. In other cases, on the contrary, we rely directly on a line of flight allowing us to burst the strata, break the roots and make new connections. There are therefore very different arrangements of map tracings, rhizomes roots, with variable coefficients of deterritorialization. There are tree or root structures in the rhizomes, but conversely a tree branch or a root division can begin to bud into a rhizome. Location does not depend here on theoretical analyses involving universals, but on a pragmatics that composes multiplicities or sets of intensities. At the heart of a tree, in the hollow of a root or in the armpit of a branch, a new rhizome can form. Or it is a microscopic element of the tree root, a rootlet, which initiates the production of the rhizome. Accounting, bureaucracy proceed by layers. They can however begin to bud, to shoot rhizome stems, as in a novel by Kafka. An intensive trait begins to work on its own account, a hallucinatory perception, a synesthesia, a perverse mutation, a play of images stand out, and the hegemony of the signifier is called into question. Gestural, mimic, playful semiotics, etc., regain their freedom in the child, and emerge from the layer, that is to say from the dominant competence of the language of the teacher. A microscopic event upsets the balance of local power. Thus the generative trees, built on the syntagmatic model of Chomsky, could open in all directions, forming a rhizome in turn. 12. To be rhizomorphic is to produce stems and filaments that look like roots, or better still connect with them by penetrating the trunk, even if it means using them for strange new uses. We are tired of the tree. We must no longer believe in trees, roots, or rootlets. We have suffered too much. The whole tree culture is based on them, from biology to linguistics. On the contrary, nothing is beautiful, nothing is amorous, nothing is political, except the underground stems and the aerial roots, the weed and the rhizome. Amsterdam, a city not at all rooted, a city rhizome with its stem canals, where utility connects with the greatest madness, in its relationship with a commercial war machine. The tree or the root inspires a sad image of the thought which ceaselessly imitates the multiple starting from a higher unit, from center or segment. Indeed, if we consider the whole branch's roots, the trunk plays the role of Opposite segment. For one of the subsets traversed from bottom to top. Such a segment will be a binding dipole, unlike the unit dipoles formed by the rays emanating from a single center. 13. But the connections can themselves proliferate as in the root system, we never get out of the 1-2, and only feigned multiplicities. Regenerations, reproductions, returns, hydras, and jellyfish don't get us out of it anymore. Tree systems are hierarchical systems that include centers of significance and subjectivation, central automata like organized memories. It is that the corresponding models are such that an element receives its information there only from a higher unit, and a subjective affectation. Pre-established connections. This is well seen in the current problems of computing and electronic machines, which still preserve the oldest thought insofar as they confer power on a memory or a central organ. In a beautiful article which denounces the imagery of command trees, centered systems or hierarchical structures, Pierre Rosenstiel and Jean Petitot remark. Admitting the primacy of hierarchical structures amounts to favoring arborescent structures. The arborescent form admits a topological explanation. In a hierarchical system, an individual admits only one active neighbor, his hierarchical superior. The transmission channels are pre-established. The arborescence pre-exists the individual who is integrated into it in a precise place, significance and subjectivation. The authors point out in this regard that, even when we believe we are reaching a multiplicity, it may be that this multiplicity is false, what we call root type, because its presentation or its apparently non-hierarchical statement does not admit in fact only a totally hierarchical solution. Thus the famous friendship theorem. If in a society any two individuals have exactly one friend in common, then there is an individual who is the friend of all the others, as Rosenstiel and Petitot say, who is the common friend. The universal friend of this society of couples, teacher, confessor, doctor. So many ideas that are strangely far from the starting axioms, the friend of the human race. Or the philosophy. Soft as it appears in classical thought, even if it is the aborted unity which is only valid through its own absence or its subjectivity, saying I know nothing, I am nothing. The authors speak in this respect of theorems of dictatorship. Such is indeed the principle of the tree roots, or the outcome, the solution of the rootlets, the structure of power. 14. To these centered systems, the authors oppose acentered systems, networks of finite automata, where communication takes place from one neighbor to any neighbor, where the rods or channels do not pre-exist, where the individuals are all interchangeable, are defined only by one state. At such a time, in such a way that the local operations are coordinated and the global final result is synchronized independently of a central instance. A transduction of intensive states replaces topology, and the graph regulating the circulation of information is in a way the opposite of the hierarchical graph. The graph has no reason to be a tree, we called such a map. Graph. War machine or firing squad issue. Is a general necessary for not individuals arrive at the same time at the state. Fire. The solution without a general is found for an acentric multiplicity comprising a finite number of states and signals of corresponding speed, from the point of view of a rhizome of war or of a guerrilla logic. It is even demonstrated that such a multiplicity, machinic arrangement, or society, rejects as an asocial intruder any centralizing, unifying automaton. 15. N, therefore, is indeed always N, 1. Rosenstiel and Petitot insist on this, that the centre-centered opposition is worth less by the things it designates than by the modes of calculation that it applies to things. Trees can correspond to the rhizome, or inversely bud into a rhizome. And it is generally true that the same thing admits the two modes of calculation or the two types of regulation, but not without a singular change of state in one case and in the other. Take, for example, psychoanalysis. Not only in its theory, but in its practice of calculation and processing, it submits the unconscious to arborescent structures, to hierarchical graphs, to summarizing memories, to central organs, phallus, tree phallus. Psychoanalysis cannot change its method in this respect. On a dictatorial conception of the unconscious, it founds its own dictatorial power, the power. Psychoanalysts on the psychoanalyzed, and psychoanalytical societies on the psychoanalysts. The room for maneuver of psychoanalysis is thus very limited. There is always a general, a leader, in psychoanalysis as in its object, General Freud. On the contrary, by treating the unconscious as an eccentric system, that is to say as a machinic network of finite automata, rhizome, schizoanalysis reaches a completely different state of the unconscious. The same remarks apply to linguistics. Rosenstiel and Petitot rightly consider the possibility of an eccentric organization of a society of words. For statements as for desires, the question is never to reduce the unconscious, to interpret it or to make it signify according to a tree. The question is to produce the unconscious. And, with it, new statements, other desires. The rhizome is this very production of the unconscious. It's curious how the tree has dominated Western reality and all Western thought, from botany to biology, anatomy, but also gnoseology, theology, ontology, all philosophy. The root foundation. Grund. Roots. And foundations. The West has a privileged relationship with the forest, and with deforestation. The fields reclaimed from the forest are populated by seed plants, the object of a culture of lines, relating to the species and of the arborescent type. Breeding in turn, deployed on fallow land, selects lines that form a whole animal tree. The East presents another figure. The relationship with the steppe and the garden, in other cases the desert and the oasis, rather than with the forest and the field. A culture of tubers which proceeds by fragmentation of the same individuals. A setting aside, a bracketing of the breeding confined in closed spaces, or pushed back in the steppe of the nomads. West, agriculture of a chosen line with many variable individuals. East, horticulture of a small number of individuals referring to a wide range of clones. Is there not in the East, especially in Oceania, a rhizomatic model that is opposed in all respects to the Western model of the tree? Haudricourt even sees in it a reason for the opposition between morals or philosophies of transcendence, dear to the West, those of immanence in the East. The God who sows and reaps, as opposed to the God who stings and digs up, the sting versus the sowing. 16. Transcendence, a specifically European disease. And it is not the same music, the earth does not have the same music. And it's not at all the same sexuality. Seed plants, even bringing together the two sexes, submit sexuality to the model of reproduction. The rhizome on the contrary is a liberation of sexuality not only in relation to reproduction, but in relation to genitality. With us, the tree has planted itself in the bodies, it has hardened and stratified even the sexes. America should be given a special place. Of course, it is not exempt from the domination of trees and a search for roots. We see it even in literature, in the quest for a national identity, and even for a European ancestry or genealogy, Kerouac goes in search of his ancestors. Still, everything important has happened proceeds by American rhizome. Beatnik, underground, bands and gangs, successive lateral thrusts in immediate connection with an outside. Difference between the American book and the European book, even when the American goes after the trees. Difference in the design of the book itself. And it's not in America the same directions. It is in the East that arboreal research and the return to the Old World take place. But the West is rhizomatic, with its Indians without ancestry, its ever-elusive limit, its shifting and displaced frontiers. A whole American map in the West, where even the trees form a rhizome. America has reversed directions. She put her east to the west, as if the earth had become round precisely in America. Its west is the very fringe of the east. 17. It is not India, as Haudetricourt believed, which acts as the intermediary between the West and the East, it is America which is the pivot and mechanism of inversion. American singer Patti Smith sings the Bible of the American dentist. Do not look for a root, follow the channel. Wouldn't there also be 2 bureaucracies, and even 3, and more? Western bureaucracy. Its agrarian origin, cadastral, roots and fields, trees, and their role as borders, the great census of William the Conqueror, feudalism, the policy of the kings of France, establishing the state on property, negotiating land through war, trials, and marriages. Is it the same in the East? Of course, it is too easy to present an orient of rhizome and immanence. But the state does not act there according to a tree structure corresponding to pre-established, arborified and rooted classes. It is a bureaucracy of canals, for example the famous weak property hydraulic power, where the state engenders canalizing and canalized classes, cf. what has never been refuted in Wittfogel's theses. The despot acts there as a river, and not as a source which would still be a point tree, or root. He marries the waters more than he sits under the tree. And the Buddha tree itself becomes a rhizome. The river of Mao and the tree of Lewis. Again, did America not act as an intermediary? Because it acts both by exterminations, internal liquidations, not only the Indians, but the farmers, etc., and by successive external surges of immigration. The flow of capital produces there an immense channel, a quantification of power, with immediate quanta where everyone enjoys in their own way in the passage of the flow money, hence the myth reality of the poor who become a billionaire to become poor again. Everything comes together in America, both tree and canal, root and rhizome. There is no universal capitalism, and in itself, capitalism is at the crossroads of all kinds of formations. It is always by nature neo-capitalism. It invents for the worse, its eastern side and its western side, and its reworking of both. At the same time, we are on the wrong track, with all these geographical distributions. A dead end, so much the better. If it is a question of showing that the rhizomes also have their own despotism, their own hierarchy, harder still, fine, because there is no dualism, no ontological dualism here and there, no axiological dualism good and bad, no American blending or synthesis. There are tree nodes in the rhizomes, rhizomatic shoots in the roots. Moreover, there are despotic formations of immanence and channeling, specific to rhizomes. There are anarchic deformations in the transcendent system of trees, aerial roots, and underground stems. What matters is that the tree root and the rhizome canal do not oppose each other as 2 models. One acts as a model and as a transcendent layer, even if it generates its own leaks. The other acts as an immanent process that reverses the model and sketches out a map, even if it constitutes its own hierarchies, even if it gives rise to a despotic channel. It is not about such and such a place on earth, or such and such a moment in history, even less about such and such a category in the mind. It is about the pattern, which keeps rising and sinking, and the process which keeps stretching, breaking, and starting again. Other or new dualism, no writing problem. You absolutely need inexact expressions to designate something exactly. And not at all because we would have to go through it, and not at all because we could only proceed by approximation. Inaccuracy is in no way an approximation, it is on the contrary the exact passage of what is done. We invoke one dualism only to challenge another. We only use a dualism of models to achieve a process that would reject any model. It is up to the reader to have cerebral correctors who undo the dualisms that we did not want to do, through which we go. It's up to the reader to arrive at the magic formula we're all looking for. Pluralism equals monism. Passing through all the dualisms which are the enemy, but the absolutely necessary enemy, the piece of furniture that we keep moving. Let's summarize the main characters of a rhizome. Unlike trees or their roots, the rhizome connects any point with any other point, and each of its features does not necessarily refer to features of the same nature. it brings into play very different regimes of signs and even non-sign states. The rhizome can be reduced neither to the one nor to the multiple. He is not the one who becomes two, nor even who would directly become 3, 4, or 5, etc. It is not a multiple that derives from the one, nor to which the one would be added, n+1. It is not made of units, but of dimensions. It constitutes linear multiplicities in n dimensions, without subject or object, spreadable on a plane of consistency, and from which the one is always subtracted, n(1). Such a multiplicity does not vary its dimensions without changing its nature in itself and being metamorphosed. Unlike a structure that is defined by a set of points and positions, binary relationships between these points and one-to-one relationships between these positions, the rhizome is made only of lines. Lines of segmentarity, of stratification, as dimensions, but also line of flight or deterritorialization as maximum dimension, according to which, by following it, the multiplicity is metamorphosed by changing its nature. One will not confuse such lines, or lineaments, with the lines of the arborescent type, which are only connections between points and positions. Unlike the tree, the rhizome is not an object of reproduction. Neither external reproduction like the tree image, nor internal reproduction like the structure tree. The rhizome is an antigenealogy. The rhizome proceeds by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, bite. Unlike graphics, drawings, or photos, unlike layers, the rhizome relates to a map that must be produced, constructed, always removable, connectable, reversible, modifiable, with multiple inputs and outputs, with its vanishing lines. These are the layers that must be transferred to the maps and not the other way around. Against centered systems, even polycentric, with hierarchical communication and pre-established links, the rhizome is an acentric, non-hierarchical, and non-signifying system, without organizing memory or central automaton, only defined by a circulation of states. What is in question in the rhizome is a relationship with sexuality, but also with the animal, with the plant, with the things of nature and artifice, quite different from the arborescent relationship. All sorts of becomings we call plateau. Any multiplicity connectable with others by superficial underground stems, so as to form and extend a rhizome. We write this book as a rhizome. We have composed it of trays. We gave it a circular shape, but that was a joke. Every morning we got up, and each of us wondered which trays he was going to take, writing 5 lines here, 10 lines elsewhere. We have had hallucinatory experiences, we have seen lines, like columns of little ants, leave one plateau to reach another. We made circles of convergence. Each plateau can be read at any place, and related to any other. For the multiple, you need a method that actually does it. No typographical trick, no lexical skill, no mixing or creation of words, no syntactical audacity can replace it. These, in fact, most often, are only mimetic processes intended to disseminate or dislocate a unit maintained in another dimension for an image book. Techno-narcissism. Typographical, lexical, or syntactic creations are only necessary if they cease to belong to the form of expression of a hidden unit to become themselves one of the dimensions of the multiplicity considered. We know of rare successes of this kind. 18. We did not know how to do it for ourselves. We only used words which, in turn, functioned for us as plateaus. R. Rhizomatic equals schizo. Analysis equals S. Trado. Analysis. Tongue sticking out, ragmatic equals M. ICRO. P. Policy. These words are concepts, but the concepts are lines, that is to say systems of numbers attached to such and such a dimension of multiplicities, strata, molecular chains, lines of flight or rupture, circles of convergence, etc. In no case do we claim the title of a science. We know no more scientificity than ideology, but only assemblages. And there are only machine assemblages of desire, like collective assemblages of enunciation. No significance, and no subjectification. Right to. Not. Any individuated enunciation remains prisoner of dominant meanings, any signifying desire refers to dominated subjects. An assemblage in its multiplicity necessarily works on semiotic flows, material flows, and social flows, regardless of the use that can be made of it in a theoretical or scientific corpus. We no longer have a tripartition between a field of reality, the world, a field of representation, the book, and a field of subjectivity, the author. But an assemblage connects certain multiplicities taken from each of these orders, so that a book does not have its continuation in the following book, nor its object in the world, nor its subject in one or more authors. In short, it seems to us that writing will never be done enough in the name of an outside. The outside has no image, no meaning, no subjectivity. The book, arrangement with the outside, against the image book of the world. A book rhizome, and no longer dichotomous, pivoting or fasciculate. Never root or plant, although it's hard not to fall back into those old ways. The things that come to my mind come to me not by their root, but by some point somewhere near their middle. So try to hold them back, so try to hold back a blade of grass that only begins to grow in the middle of the stem, and hold on to it. 19. Why is it so difficult? This is already a question of perceptual semiotics. Not easy to perceive things from the middle, and not from top to bottom or vice versa, from left to right or vice versa. Try and you will see that everything changes. We write history, but we have always written it from the point of view of sedentary people, and in the name of a unitary state apparatus, at least possible even when we were talking about nomads. R. Rhizomatic equals nomadology. Yet their two rare and great successes, for example concerning the Children's Crusades. The book by Marcel Schwab which multiplies the stories like so many trays of variable dimensions. Andrzejewski's book. The Gates of Paradise. Made of a single uninterrupted sentence, flow of children, flow of walking with trampling, stretching, haste, semiotic flow of all the confessions of children who come to declare themselves to the old monk at the head of the procession, flow of desire and of sexuality, each one gone out of love, and more or less directly led by the dark posthumous and pederastic desire of the Comte de Vendôme, with circles of convergence. The important thing is not that the flows make one or multiple, we are no longer there. There is a collective assemblage of enunciation, a machine assemblage of desire, one inside the other, and plugged into a prodigious outside which creates multiplicity in every way. And then, more recently, Armand Faraka's book on the Fourth Crusade, La Dislocation. Where the sentences deviate and disperse, or else jostle and coexist, and the letters, the typography begin to dance, as the crusade delirious. 20. These are models of nomadic and rhizomatic writing. Writing espouses a war machine and lines of flight, it abandons strata, segmentation, sedentarity, the state apparatus. But why do we still need a model? Isn't the book still an image of the Crusades? Is there not yet a guarded unit, as a pivotal unit in the case of Schwab, as an aborted unit in the case of Faraci, as a unit of the mortuary count in the most beautiful case of the Gates of Paradise? Do we need a deeper nomadism than that of the Crusades, that of true nomads, or the nomadism of those who no longer even move and who no longer imitate anything? They only arrange. How will the book find a sufficient outside with which it can fit in the heterogeneous, rather than a world to reproduce? Cultural, the book is necessarily a tracing. Tracing of itself already, tracing of the previous book by the same author, tracing of other books regardless of the differences, endless tracing of concepts and words in place, tracing of the present, past, or future world. 21. But the anti-cultural book can still be traversed by too heavy a culture. he will however make an active use of it for forgetting and not for memory, for underdevelopment and not for progress to be developed, for nomadism and not for a sedentary lifestyle, for maps and not for tracing. R. Rhizomatic equals pop analysis. Even if the people have something else to do than read it, even if the blocks of university culture or pseudoscience remain too painful or burdensome. Because do you know, science would be completely mad if we let it. See mathematics, they are not a science, but a prodigious slang, and nomadic. Even and especially in the theoretical domain, any precarious and pragmatic scaffolding is better than the tracing of concepts, with their cuts and their progress which change nothing. The imperceptible rupture, rather than the significant cut. Never has history understood nomadism, never has the book understood the outside. Write for those who can't read. People sneer, you are the worst academics, you do not see the words you use, and you're blackmailing knowledge. We do not answer, we do not have the same conception of a book, we have never quoted ourselves, we have never sung the song of the avant-garde style Buoyant Achille or Telkel. At. During. Do not disturb us. Edith Piaf. What a pleasure it will be, if people say, there, they disappoint us, they have gone mad. And if they say, they are not renewed, so much the better too. We are elsewhere. What did the nomads do? They invented the war machine against the state apparatus, quite different from the state apparatus. Rhizome of a war machine against the state tree. The arborescence is precisely the power of the state. Throughout a long history, the state has been the model of books and thought. The logos, the philosopher king, the transcendence of the idea, the interiority of the concept, the republic of spirits, the tribunal of reason, the functionaries of thought, the legislator and subject man. Claim of the state to be the internalized image of a world order, and to root man. But the relationship of a war machine with the outside is not another model, it is an arrangement that makes thought itself nomadic, the book a piece for all mobile machines, a stem for a rhizome, Kleist and Kafka versus Goethe. Most of the books we cite are books we love, sometimes for secret or perverse reasons. It doesn't matter that some are well known, others little known, others forgotten. We would only like to quote with love. We do not claim to constitute a sum or to reconstitute a memory, but rather to proceed by forgetting and subtracting, thus to make a rhizome, to make machines above all that can be dismantled, to form environments which allow this, that, to float for a moment. Crumbly blocks in soups. Better yet, a functional, pragmatic book. Take whatever you want. The book has ceased to be a microcosm, in the classical way, or in the European way. The book is not an image of the world, even less a signifier. It is not a beautiful organic totality, nor is it a unity of meaning. When you ask Michel Foucault what a book is for him, he answers, it is a toolbox. Proust, who nevertheless passes for highly significant, said that his book was like glasses. See if they suit you, if you perceive thanks to them what you would not have been able to grasp otherwise. Otherwise, leave my book, look for others that would suit you better. Find pieces of books, those that serve you or that suit you. We no longer read, but also we no longer write in the old way. There is no death of the book, but another way of reading. In a book there is nothing to understand, but a lot to use. Nothing to interpret or signify, but a lot to experience. The book must make machine with something, it must be a small tool on an outside. No representation of the world, nor world as signifying structure. The book is not a tree root, it is part of a rhizome, plateau of a rhizome for the reader to whom it is suitable. The combinations, the permutations, the uses are never inside the book, but depend on the connections with this or that outside. Yes, take what you want. We don't claim to be a school. The schools, the sects, the chapels, the churches, the vanguards and the rearguards are still trees which, in their rise as in their ridiculous fall, Crush all that passes of importance. Write to N1, write by slogans. Make rhizome and not root, never plant. Don't sow, sting. Don't be one nor multiple, be multiplicities. Do the line and never the point. Speed turns point into line. 22. Be fast, even on the spot. Luck line, hip line, vanishing line. Don't arouse a general in you. Make maps, not photos or drawings. Be the Pink Panther, and may your love still be like the wasp and the orchid, the cat and the baboon.